Okay, hey everybody, and welcome. This is the Apostate Prophet. I hope you're having a fantastic day. I'm here today with a guest that I will appreciate very much, and so will many of you as well. We will talk about a lot of things that I personally find very interesting, especially about Arabia, pre-Islamic Arabia, several matters that we never deeply go into and that we don't have much information on. Dr. Hoyland, how are you doing?
Very nice to be here. Thank you to talk to you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. I read of your stuff, of your research many times in the past. For some reason, I never thought about actually getting in touch. And then I thought, out of the blue, at some point, I thought, why don't I just contact him and ask to speak to him? Uh, I read two of your books so far. I read the In God's Path, which is I think very interesting, and the
Thank you.
whole early conquests of the conquests of Islam. And then the other book I have right here, which I find personally very interesting, Arabia and the Arabs, that I think is very, very insightful. And I would definitely recommend others get these books as well. So I want to ask you right away, when it comes to the whole issue of pre-Islamic Arabia, and all the knowledge that we have on pre-Islamic Arabia regarding the culture and the religious practices and all that, it seems to me that there is not much information available for the general population. There is not much that we can find online if we do a quick search. The information about pre-Islamic Arabia seems rather, uh, obscure, rather hidden. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. I mean, it's actually the main reason I wrote this book because trying to teach pre-Islamic Arabia to students was actually very difficult. A lot of the literature is very specialist, heavily focused on things like inscriptions and very detailed philological analysis. But the main reason it's a difficult subject to access is the material is very diffuse. We're talking about a huge area, but there's large desert regions. It was difficult to traverse before modern means of transportation. And it's one thing, perhaps I should say, when I was going to write this book on Arabia, I'd expected to be able to write a more uniform sort of work, but I kept coming up against the problem that it falls into different zones. And that really goes back to the very basic differences in the environment and hydrology. So in Yemen, you get monsoon rains. East Arabia, who are aquifers, and in the northwest of Arabia, you have oases. So it's a really, that in a pre-modern world where people are so much attached to the basic facts of the environment, that means that it generates very different types of culture, and that makes it more difficult to study. It's not a single zone, which we tend to think of now as just Arabia, and that's it.
Yeah, there's also an element that I saw emphasized in your other book, which is about the conquests in God's Path, where you are trying to clarify this whole idea that you're basically trying to you are explaining that people often think about Arabia and pre-Islamic Arabia as a more united culture, whereas in reality it was very diverse, very different internally, both before Islam and even after the rise of Islam during the early conquests, for example. Um, I remember reading that and finding that very, very insightful. What could you say about the sources regarding pre-Islamic Arabia? Are these sources, where are these sources mainly from? Are these Islamic sources mostly that we have at our disposal at the moment?
So this is the other reason why it's quite difficult to study, because they're very fragmented and diverse. You have the writings of outsiders, and those can be in many, many languages, particularly Greek, different dialects of Aramaic, Latin. But they're very much outsiders. They don't know that much. A lot of it is hearsay. They become better informed once the trade routes become more established between the Mediterranean and India, which go right round Arabia. And so people start to take more notice because they have to put in at ports and so on. But nevertheless, they're outsiders. So it's a particular perspective. In terms of insider writings, it's mainly inscriptions which come particularly from Yemen, and inscribed objects, but a fair number, really, from Northwest Arabia and from the east, but much less than, and much um, less in scale than, because in Yemen you get these fantastic monumental inscriptions on tombs and palaces, and those number in the thousands. So that's a rich source for the history of Arabia. The other form, so some sources are time limited. So pre-Islamic Arabian poetry is very rich, but it is only from this very short period, probably about the 5th and 6th centuries AD.
I see. And when it comes to the Islamic sources, one could assume that there is a certain bias in Islamic sources regarding the pre-Islamic Arab history, right? Because especially since in Islam there is this whole idea that the pre-Islamic era is called the era of ignorance, the Jahiliyyah, and I would say Islamic sources, early Islamic sources, which tell us about pre-Islamic Arabia, uh, have a certain bias, right?
Yeah, that's part of the problem, that they're looking at it through the lens of Islam and seeing, they have a basic sense that people before Islam are basically doomed to hell, so that doesn't help impartial
Yeah, yeah,
historical writing. But the other thing really is that their only interest is in the Prophet's lifetime, and a little before, but not very much. So
yeah.
and just the Hijaz. So, and this was another reason for me writing my book on Arabia, because we're talking about thousands of years of history in a huge area and different cultures, and yet from the Islamic sources you just get this little Jahiliyyah tag, which is basically this one little northwest Arabian sector, basically from around the period 550 to 620. So it's very limited.
Speaking of this, this Islamic narrative that I myself also learned in a Muslim upbringing. I'm a former Muslim. I learned that it was very common, very frequent in pre-Islamic Arabia to bury little girls. Uh, you know, as soon as they're born, female infanticide was very big, and Islam came and basically ended this cruel practice and this whole narrative. Now, I understand that there are some disagreements about how accurate this is and how widespread this practice really was. Is there more that we can know about this from a historical perspective?
So we have zero evidence outside the Quran for this. It's mentioned in the Quran, and anything that is mentioned in the Quran will be commented on ad infinitum. There's hundreds of years of people commenting on these individual verses, and to some extent, it generates historical material, and that people want to give specific examples, because some of the commentary on the Quran can be very serious, philological, legal, but some of it's more storytelling-ish. What lies behind this particular reference, and then well, there was a time when so and so happened. We have no way to verify this at all, and obviously, as you said, it taps into the basic narrative of our Islamic sources that Islam improved the lot of the people of Arabia, so, and made them better morally. There's a very famous hadith put into the mouths of different companions, saying, "Oh, we used to be terrible people. We worshipped idols. We raped, we pillaged, we buried our little girls. But now we've got Islam. We're all very decent, upstanding people." And I don't want to mean that in any way to belittle it, but I just mean that's a literary kind of picture that's being drawn up there, and it's very difficult to, it's a bit like the British could say, "Oh, we brought order to Africa." Before that, there was no order, but again, it's a very specific type of narrative that we can't just simply buy into.
When it comes to women, for example, we have a similar thing. The Islamic idea is that women were treated differently, treated as much lesser beings in the past, and that the pre-Islamic Arabs used to take dozens of wives. It never really made sense to me how that would be possible, that the average man in pre-Islamic Arabia just has like 20 wives or 15 wives or whatever it is. Is this also something that is primarily just attributed to Islamic narrative, or is there more to that?
So again, we're reliant on the Islamic tradition for this. But actually, it is quite different from what the Quran and later more religious narratives. So what I should say is it's potentially better to possible that we should separate out religious narratives and tribal narratives. In the tribal narratives, actually, no, people don't have many wives, and you would expect that because they're not very wealthy. What is happening is that they may be having many affairs. So there's more adultery going on, if you like, and more secret liaisons. And that's also backed up by pre-Islamic Arabian poetry. Whereas under Islamic times, especially in the early Islamic times, the Arabs are much more wealthy, much more powerful, have much more access to women, particularly foreign women. And so you're seeing more actual wives and concubines in a formalized way. But zina, fornication, adultery is much more stringently prohibited.
What can we say about the general practices? We know certain things about pre-Islamic Arabia that we mostly know from Islamic sources, also some from quite some research that has been done. In general, could you say that there is a unifying identifier of certain beliefs and practices that pre-Islamic Arabs had that held them together? Or is it just a huge variety of different beliefs?
So somewhere in between those two, I would say. So as I say, you have very different cultures there. So in Yemen, East Arabia, and Northwest Arabia, you have distinct cultural zones, and within those zones, you see a fair degree of uniformity of religious belief. For more pastoralist areas in Central Arabia, going towards very nomadic groups, then it's a very different situation. And there's a lot, you're not precisely because they're nomadic, you're not going to see temples. We don't have inscriptions from them. So our only source really is actually pre-Islamic Arabian poetry. And then you see very little reference to religion and gods and so on. So it seems like different, both geographical zones and different cultural groups will have different religious practices. Now there's a huge all these pagan inscriptions, basically they've gone by around 400 AD. And at this point, we have extremely little evidence because we used to have all these wonderful inscriptions, but they just stopped pretty much dead at that time. And we assume that as with the rest of the Middle East, people are switching more to Judaism and Christianity. But to be honest, we have no real information from that, which is why for the period after 400, especially the Hijaz, you have a lot of weird and wonderful theories by modern scholars about the fact that maybe that's not where Islam was born. Maybe everyone was Christian. We just don't know. To be honest, it's a huge amount of speculation from zero evidence.
We also have an influx of Abrahamic religion at some point, right? I mean,
that's what they say. Yeah, Christianity and Judaism they definitely must be spreading at this time, because you can see in the Northeast, you're seeing some Christian churches and monasteries on the very fringes, which could be partly to do with servicing trading communities. And then in Yemen as well, then we have inscriptions which do mention Jews and Christians and their beliefs.
And I think with the official recognition of certain doctrines by the Roman Empire, there is a spread of Christian heresies in this region, as far as I understand it, as mentioned in certain early Christian sources. As far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong.
So the tricky thing is how much this is a literary topos or a kind of prejudice. So there's a number of sayings by people outside Arabia that Arabia is a land of heresies. Whether that's because heretics were fleeing into Arabia as a safe haven because you can get away from the authorities, or whether it's just general prejudice against more pastoralists and so on. It's impossible to say, really. The other evidence which some people adduce who like this idea as Arabia as a land of heresies is the Quran itself, because it seems to have a number, or it refers to a number of doctrines of Christians, most famously the fact that Jesus wasn't really crucified, it was just an image of him. And that is close to a doctrine of certain Christian groups from the 3rd, 4th centuries.
And there are also certain narratives about Jesus in general that seem to correspond with later heretical writings or legends as they are seen within Christianity about Jesus. Right? So,
yes, it's very difficult though to tie these individual references in the Quran to groups. Although there is there's a lot of scholarship expended on it. It's kind of popular, partly because on the serious side, there was an attempt, and it's a very interesting one, to link Quranic doctrines and references to contemporary late antique writings in the broader world of Palestine and Syria, which is a very interesting study, and it has had some good results.
what can we say about coming back to Arabia, specifically to the Hijaz region? Now, with the emergence of Islam, according to the standard traditional narrative, revolves around Mecca and Medina. And in Mecca, Muhammad is born into, or Muhammad is in a society where people are described as polytheists. They have certain idols, certain temples. One of them is Mecca. Now, the Islamic narrative is, of course, that the Kaaba is Kaaba. The Islamic narrative is, of course, that the Kaaba is attributed to worship in the one God and to Abraham and all that. What do we really know about the background and the history, specifically the pre-Islamic history of the Kaaba?
So, unfortunately, very little is the short answer to that. From Mecca and Medina itself, we have pretty much zero evidence, as you would expect, but from the archaeological point of view, because archaeology has never been allowed there, you might have expected inscriptions, but we do not have any at all from there. If we widen our lens a bit, we do find inscriptions in the older oases to the north, Madain Saleh, so ancient Dedan, Ula, Taima as well. So from these oases, we have quite a few inscriptions, some Jewish, some pagan. But again, as I said earlier, they stop at around 400. The very latest dated inscription from that area is 456 AD, but most of them are much earlier. And so that means we don't really have any hard evidence for constructing what's going on in that area. The fact that you have Jewish inscriptions very early, for example, in Madain Saleh, already in the 1st century AD, suggests that Abrahamic ideas do circulate. To what degree they were adopted by non-Jewish populations, it's impossible to say. One thing I should say, again, looking at broader context, we can, from inscriptions, see that some of the references to pagan practices in the Quran, for example, nusub, standing stones, where you actually sacrificed an animal, blood was meant to flow on the stone, so that is mentioned in pre-Islamic inscriptions. Stones, ungraven stones, were considered what you call a betil, so a beit Allah, the idea of that they were where the deity had their representation on earth, reflect for that local community, and often those were by springs. So again, you could say that Kaaba and Zamzam in Mecca fit into this, but it is only looking at broad context. We don't have direct reference to Mecca.
There are some theories about how stones like the black stone at the corner of the Kaaba, or stones similar to that, were used in connection to certain fertility rites and worship in terms of fertility and sexuality. Is there anything to that?
So that's kind of comes from, as I said, the kind of tribal tradition, if you like, best represented by the Kitab al-Asnam sort of literature that you get from Hisham al-Kalbi and others. Again, it's very difficult to assess what they know or how much. So there's a literature coming out of Christianity towards pagans. It's a polemical literature. It's saying that pagans do this. This is how pagans think. They worship idols which they think are real living beings, even though surely they cannot help them. They have fertility practices because they're debauched people, these pagans. And so it's very difficult for us now without any contemporary evidence from Arabia to distinguish this later polemic from
I
what
see.
might have been
I see.
real practice.
I see. Speaking of Kitab al-Asnam, the Book of Idols, what I find very interesting in that book is it mentions certain different Kaabas or Kaaba-like buildings. For example, most prominently, we have a certain temple down in Yemen, as it is described, called Dhul Khalasa, for example. So it seems as though establishing certain buildings as cubes, uh, because Kaaba is for cube, was common practice in pre-Islamic Arabia and was practiced by people all over Arabia, right?
Yeah, and this is so here we have good comparative evidence from the Nabatean realm, where you have quite a few cubes which are either just left untouched or they have like very minimal anthropological features like a mouth and a nose inscribed onto them, and then a reference to the deity, someone calling upon praying to the deity or making offerings to them. So yes, that does look, especially so in that area, the sandstone is very easy to carve. So that makes so obviously the Kaaba is very different because it's probably a meteorite, but stone worship is definitely there's good evidence for it across
What is
Arabia.
what is the significance of? I'm not sure if you can say anything about this, but what is the significance of buildings like the Kaaba, of it being a cube that people refer to as a house? If this was common practice in pre-Islamic Arabia, what exactly was the purpose of that?
So I suppose that well, you say it's a general human thing that the idea of a totally transcendent deity who's up there and never has no contact with us is unappealing. People would like some form of either place they can go to or some sense that the deity has contact with us. I mean, you could say that explains the whole idea of Jesus in Christianity. And so the idea of houses of God, Beitels, which are quite widespread, in fact, across the Middle East in the pagan period, is that this is a place you can go to and you can have some sense that the deity is actually present, listening to you when you make your offerings or prayers to it.
Yeah, and I guess the circumambulation around this house is then very much symbolically a veneration, reverence of the specific deity or deities that this house is supposed to represent.
Yes, I mean it's difficult to exactly get into some of these pagan practices, the actual significance of it. But many of the practices that are mentioned to do with the Hajj in Arabia and the veneration of the Kaaba are quite broad, well-known ones. For example, throwing stones at a pillar. It's interesting how widespread that is across a number of areas of the Middle East.
What about the numbers associated with these things, like circumambulation 7 times, for example, or similar issues, similar patterns and numbers? Are these merely certain practices that came from previous cultures and which we don't have a proper explanation for? What does that really look like?
Yeah, I mean, when numbers are significant, they tend to be magical numbers, 7, obviously, days a week and so on like that. And so the difficulty we have often with pagan practices is we can assume they're ancient, but we can't really demonstrate that because we're often tapping in then to prehistoric cultures where we have no text. It used to be a very popular idea in the 19th century that there were an ancient sort of religion of mankind and of just certain bigger cultures. So there were books with titles like The Religion of the Semites, that idea that all people of the Middle East had a kind of ancient form of religion that they go back to in the same way as like there's one language, there's one Ur-Semitic language. And the idea is that if you look across the cultures, you'll see these similarities. And certainly you do. I mean, looking really far back, stones are always important to pretty much all human cultures. It doesn't matter whether you go to Britain, Stonehenge, or wherever. There's that fantastic discovery in Turkey recently of this ring of stones with engravings, which is actually dated to something like 18,000 before the present. So it's amazing. But the problem with this sort of thinking is it's not so much that it's not true as much as it's so generalizing. Whereas what we really want to know is the details. Your example of the circumambulation, when people did this, what were they thinking of? What did it signify for them, this practice?
I hear so many different theories about that. One of the most common ones is that it is supposed to imitate the orbiting of objects in the sky around a certain main object. Not sure if that really makes sense, though, or that this is merely a sign of veneration. It's interesting to theorize about that. I guess we don't really have a conclusive answer on that thing.
No, it's not something we can easily tap into ourselves, is it? And our minds have been brainwashed by monotheist religious ideas, and so it's quite difficult to get into this polytheist. And it depends what approach you take. So if you're a more social theory of religion, then you take it that these practices bind. It's not that important what they are, but the fact that you do them together as a community means that it binds you as a community. But if you're more a symbolist, then the symbols of whether it's to do with the planets or whatever is very important.
According to your estimation, now when I discuss about the Kaaba and Kaaba's other Kaaba-like buildings, like the one mentioned in Yemen, for example, that one is very significant to me, I think, to the narrative, because we have a clear report in the Hadith in which Muhammad commands one of his followers to go and destroy that certain building, and the guy then goes and destroys it and kills the people around it and comes back, and Muhammad praises him, according to the narrative. And when this is discussed, some apologists offer the explanation that that building was an imitation of the Kaaba, which is the original cube that was established. But from a non-Islamic perspective, it is hard to say what was the original Kaaba, whether there is an original Kaaba, and how widely, practiced it was to build such cubes. What can we really say about whether the Kaaba was just one more building like many others in this region, or whether it has some originality?
So, in terms of how it's viewed, I mean, given that in the Nabatean realm from centuries before Muhammad, you're seeing these cubic objects. And as I said, the nice thing about taking the Nabatean realm is that we have inscriptions on them and they're telling us what they are. So we have a lot more information that way. So I would assume it's not so much to do with there being an original, because it makes no sense with regard to stones. I mean, they're pretty ancient objects. So for you to say this one stone is the original piece, that it must be propaganda, really. But it's more, I think, competition between different holy sites.
I see.
And different deities and different representatives of the deities. And this is very well attested in the pagan world, going right back. So when the Assyrians, for example, want to demonstrate their strength, they send an army down and they grab cultic objects of a particular group. And we have actually instances of this going right back to the earliest references to Arab groups in the Syrian desert, where it says, we have pictures, in fact, on the Assyrian palaces and temples where they show that the army grabbing the cultic objects of Arabs or dwellers in that area. They have their tents nearby, so we know, in some sense, there are at least pastoralist groups in Arabia, and they're taking off the cultic objects, because obviously by that means you demonstrate your superiority over there, that your God is superior to their God.
Do we assume that the cube building itself, the Kaaba, was established due to the black rock, the meteorite rock, or whatever its origin may be? Or do we think that this is merely something that people took from somewhere else and put on there? Or do these two things depend on each other?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. That, again, until you have scientific analysis of the Kaaba, it's not going to be easy to answer these questions.
Why is it not allowed to do? Why do they not allow to go into archaeological research and all that in this area? Is it for religious reasons, I think?
And Saudi, their status really comes from being the guardian of the most holy sites of Islam. So I can understand they're not really going to want that narrative to be questioned, um, or just the broader idea, which is a quite likely one to some extent, that there were many cultic sites initially in the earliest period of Islam, including Jerusalem. So that's not going to be popular with the Saudi government. Inevitably, they like to preserve the standard narrative.
Understandably so, I guess. um, There's one interesting thing that you mention in one of your books, in both of them, I think, which I personally find interesting, which is that Arabia was home not only to one prophet, but that it was a common thing in Arabia that prophets would emerge and prophets would declare a message. Do we have a certain record of people who were self-proclaimed prophets, just like Muhammad, who emerged before him and after him in Arabia?
Yeah, so I don't think I say that it's common in general in all time in Arabia, but very specifically in the time of Muhammad and a bit before as well. We have references, but again, in Muslim sources, to a number of prophets at the time. You could assume that's because this is a time of, well, so you either take it that this was a common thing in general, or that it was a particularly traumatic time, and so it brought forth more prophets. You could say, at the moment, thinking about climate change getting more serious, we're getting more prophetic-like figures who are predicting terrible times and so on. So there's a kind of social anthropological background here, which is that for people that are not used to being able to act politically, to set up political structures and so on, then religion provides that means by which they can unite a body of people that might be rather disparate otherwise. It forms a common ideology, if you like. And you see this in particular during colonial period, with lots of prophets appearing in places conquered by the French and the British. And again, it's a way for that person, because they had no proper political structures. The prophet serves to unite various peoples as one group.
That's interesting. We have certain, there's especially one self-proclaimed prophet in the time of Muhammad and also after his time, Musaylima. I think we have, I remember reading in a certain Persian source that is from centuries later, and in that source it is said that people who believed in him as a prophet still continued to be around, even in secret, and that there are traces of his religion still alive. Do you have any knowledge on this? Did you ever look into this? Or
Yeah, and the difficult thing is, it depends how skeptical you are towards the Muslim sources, because we only have these accounts in Muslim sources.
that's the problem.
Written start the very, very earliest Muslim source that you can actually pick up and hold is from the 820s. So that's 200 years after Muhammad is active. So it's very difficult to know whether that accounts to, increase the drama of the story of Muhammad, that he had to overcome opposition, or how much it reflects real events. And even if it reflects real events, how much people writing 200 years later had genuine information.
I guess it can't be taken at face value as historically reliable or accurate. So some of the things said in there really surprised me, though. It's like I'm not sure if I'm I'm not sure if I'm supposed to present these things as good, positive, or as rather negative when you look at it from an Islamic perspective. But such as that he preached that we should not make any speculations about supernatural beings, that there is no Qibla, that there are only 3 daily prayers, that you can drink alcohol, you can have extramarital sex, and so on. Like all these very big problems that Islam presents, these very big, tight moral laws that Islam presents are not found in this religion, and this religion apparently advocates for the contrary and all that. But anyway, it's completely besides the point here.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing there, I suppose, is how are you meant to read this? I mean, were the people who were being told this or reading it expressing horror? This
Yeah,
horrible title.
that's what I mean.
I mean, because in a modern sense, you might think, "Oh, that sounds much better."
Yeah. That's what I
May
mean.
not
I
have
mean,
been the
when I
reaction.
read this, I'm like, oh, this is much more free and liberal. But then,
Yeah.
was it really meant to be written that way, or was it just
Yeah.
more a condemnation of it? So,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, One issue is Allah. Now, Allah is the primary god of Islam, known as the one God. The issue is that the history and the origin of the name Allah and of the God Allah is a matter that is quite problematic, and that there is quite some controversy about. Some people assert that Allah existed as a separate deity within the pre-Islamic pagan culture. Others say, I think there is a theory that Allah is actually Hubal, who was the main god of the Kaaba. There are other theories that Allah is merely just the monotheistic prophet adopted into Islam, and so on. What do we know, and what are your findings on this?
Yeah, it's a kind of fascinating question. To my mind, it's hard to think that the actual name isn't and concept isn't coming from the broader Judeo-Christian world, because it's the same word. Allah is the word in Syriac, Aramaic generally for God, understood as one big, dominant, transcendent God. The question, I suppose, is how then? What is that getting applied to, though? Have they simply taken the Judeo-Christian God, was Muhammad or his predecessors, or have they mapped it onto an existing pagan god? And to my mind, I have to say, it seems more likely to me that it's a Judeo-Christian thinking, because as Judaism and Christianity spread through the peninsula, then you would expect ideas of God in that sort of sphere, that it's a creator God that is transcendent and all powerful, and it's actually the pagan gods will be being pushed away, not being adopted, because the mapping tends to happen from pagan to pagan cultures. So, for example, the pagan Arabian goddess Alat gets mapped onto Athena, and so that you expect that substitution. But I don't think we have examples where Zeus is mapped onto God, Hotheos. So I don't think that mapping is really occurring. The arguments for it being an Arabian god, Arabian pagan god, tend to be made by those who want to say that it's an Arabian heritage, that Allah belongs to Arabia. It's nothing to do with, it's not simply being adopted from the Roman world.
As far as I see it, as a non-expert layman on these matters, I think it is quite reasonable to suggest that it is the same understanding of the supreme God that is adopted from, monotheistic or I don't know, Abrahamic general practices and beliefs. I think if you look into the history of Allah or Elaha, we find that this is merely in reference to the high God or the highest God, or even in cultures where there are more gods accepted. What I find interesting, though, is in the Quran. Isn't there in the Quran there is this one polemical verse in which the Quran rejects the idea that Allah has three daughters? Uh, so, and then how is that reconciled with the idea that Allah is merely of this Abrahamic origin? Could it be that these pre-Islamic Arab pagans also had this idea of that same God, but then they just attributed more deities uh, as immediate family members to that God? And it seems a little bit cloudy to me, honestly.
Yeah, so here I suppose one should distinguish between, so there's different groups that we're talking about here. So for those people who are having effectively this new deity and religion gradually becoming dominant and always imposed on them, then they're likely to try and preserve some aspects of their religion. So, for example, in Brazil, when Christianity spreads, there was a black kind of female deity, and so then in their thinking, they assimilate Mary as Mother of God to this black deity. So you can understand from their side. So I could understand from the perspective of pagan Meccans, which I'll just say for the sake of argument, who worship Hubal, that they might, to preserve aspects of their own pagan culture, say that, well, Hubal is Allah, really, in the same way as some pagans did actually make an identification between Zeus and the Christian god. But that's a different group from, I suppose, those people who are doing the converting and propagandizing, if you like, on behalf of Christianity and so on. So we have to allow for different visions and perspectives on the deity.
This could indicate and imply that the belief in Hubal and in the other deities is a more native belief to these people in pre-Islamic Arabia, and that they later on adopt certain ideas from different beliefs and create a synchronism between these.
Yeah, because if you're thinking, well, from a more secular perspective, monotheism doesn't really have that much substance. It's mainly a belief in a single one God. And when you actually start taking apart those monotheisms, you realize actually most of the stuff that goes into it, the stuffing, is actually pagan bits. So in Christianity, as we come up to Christmas, you think, well, there's the Christmas tree. I mean, that's a classic there's a Viking pagan belief. And there's a whole host of things that really have come from different pagan groups and been put into and accepted by, and made part of that monotheism to give it a bit more stuffing. And really, as was pointed out a long time ago in the 19th century, a lot of the rituals of the pilgrimage, Muslim pilgrimage, they just have such a pagan feel to them that it's hard to think they're not a local practice that manages to get preserved in Islam.
That's the issue with. I'm trying to be. In that regard, I'm trying to be really as objective and reasonable as possible. But a while after I stopped believing that this religion is absolutely true, I kept looking at the Kaaba, at the circumambulation, at the practices of the pilgrimage, the Hajj, and I can't really put my finger on it and put it into words, but I just keep getting this perception, this feeling, wait a minute, this doesn't really look like monotheistic worship. This simply looks like something of tribalistic, very ancient tribalistic polytheistic origin that leads way back and that we can't really explain within Islamic narratives.
But as I say, effectively, as a more secular person, my perspective, I mean, I can look at, because I don't mean anything against Islam when I say it has these pagan elements in it, because so does Christianity. I mean, if you look at Easter, great festival, it's a famous pagan festival, the Easter festival, the beginning of the new year, a new birth, a new growth. So in Christianity, you get all these things about eggs and so on. It's classic kind of pagan beliefs, but that doesn't necessarily diminish it. And the same for Islam. I mean, it's got a lot of classic pagan features, and you really see this in the pilgrimage. But
maybe it is then a mistake to separate monotheism from polytheism so much and to put a barrier between them as if they were completely different two things. But it could be more that religion and culture develops over time and things simply merge into each other. And certain tribalistic, polytheistic practices merge into the newly adopted monotheistic beliefs.
Yeah, I think where it changes the polytheistic to monotheistic view, you're right. In some ways, it's not so different. But the big change is the idea that there's only one dominant God and everyone else is wrong. If they follow another God, they're wrong. And that perspective is unfortunately a very negative one for world history, you could say. Well, unless you're a military historian. But the pagan one, where the classic Arabian proverb is "when you pass a place, pay your respects to its gods," is a classic pagan one. It's pagan gods are local; they're not single trans-regional dominant forces. They're local. They might have a little bit more breadth, but they're not. I mean, the Nabatean main god is classic Dushara. Dushara is the lord of the Shara, meaning that mountain range where he dwells and has dominance. And that is a big change, that more local and tolerant perspective, religious perspective, to a much more universalist and intolerant view. That changes.
Could we
That's
say
really
that?
a big change.
Could we say that pre-Islamic polytheism was, in a sense, accepting and pluralistic, even when it came to beliefs that are, not polytheistic, that are outside of its own sphere of multiple gods and all that? So, I don't know if you want me to clarify this question, but
Yeah, can you clarify that a bit?
yeah. So, could we say that the pre-Islamic polytheists were a little bit more, you know, not as much, not as exclusivist, but more accepting of the beliefs of others, even if these other people held beliefs that are contrary to their own polytheistic understanding, such as when Christians, came to them, or when Jews came to them? Could we say that the polytheists were in general accepting of the Christians and the Jews despite their beliefs, or was there hostility toward them?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question. I mean, I don't want to romanticize and say that pagan life was lovely and everyone was very tolerant. But I do mean it happens on a more localized sphere. So, but when Jews and Christians came, so the different the between pagans, you're going to see less of a sense that you have to follow my God.
Hmm.
So the difference when Jews and Christian propagandists arrive, in a pagan village, is that they're going to say your gods are wrong,
Uh-huh.
and you have to get rid of them. And so the pagans aren't necessarily going to be so welcoming. And often there was Arabia is more different, but in a lot of places, especially where Christianity was spread by European colonialists, then you're seeing a dominance dimension to it, which actually happens earlier to some extent, but it's very strong. The tying up of power goes with also an idea that our God is the only God you must follow. You must get rid of all your beliefs. So
Well,
you could understand that that's not so well received. And of course, that's
uh,
the narrative in the Quran and the Islamic sources, that a number of the pagan Meccans didn't really like this idea that they had to jettison the beliefs of their forefathers.
Well, that's the thing, and I think this is kind of the power of indoctrination here. When I, as I grew up, I kept learning this entire narrative that the pre-Islamic polytheists were like horrible people, and they were very intolerant and very hostile towards these pure ideas of belief in one God and worshiping one God and all that. But then, I don't know. When I stepped outside of it, I thought, wait a minute. I mean, it's not like Muhammad is doing something and just minding his own business, and these people are coming and telling him, "Hey, you are not allowed to do whatever you're doing." No, but what's actually happening is that he is saying and he's coming out and asserting that their gods are false and they are doomed and they are wrong and they will go to hell, and only Allah is the true God. And they even, according to the Islamic narrative, they even repeatedly tell him, "Please, do whatever you want, just stop this, just stop condemning the beliefs of your forefathers and our gods." And in the end, they turn intolerant. So what is actually happening here is these people are not oppressing him for simply minding his own business and practicing his religion. They are becoming hostile in reaction to his intolerant exclusivist ideology.
Yeah, and the main kind of complaint they have is a really broad one for pagans against this sort of intrusion of monotheism, where this is the religion of our forefathers. It's a community religion, and it's an old tradition. So yeah, very much in the end, Muhammad was trampling local traditions, and that goes for wherever Christianity spread, really, throughout the Middle East. Paganism in general is a more local, by and large, it's a localized affair, and so it's got a very strong communitarian dimension to it, for sure.
What is the whole thing like when we learn about Islam? We learn that certain gods are very prominent, like Allat and Uzza and Manat and all that. What is the significance of these people? This might be a very nonsensical question. I don't know. I didn't really think this through. But
Mhm.
what is the significance of this diversity of gods that is being worshipped by these people? Like, what do they hope from worshipping different gods? And is it just that each one of these gods goes back a long way with certain tribes, and they then come together and unite these gods? And do they serve as a general god to their own tribes? I don't know if you can
So,
help me understand this, but
so I put for the Hijazi world, we don't have that much information. But if we go to Yemen, say, so very near, it's kind of reasonable comparison, where we have a huge amount of inscriptions which are offer prayers or thanksgiving and requests to deities. You can see that you have kind of higher gods of broad communities. So there's a number of different peoples in South Arabia, Sabah, people of Hadramaut, Kataban. So each of them have a deity for the whole community. But then after that, you get deities of places. Presumably, this area is important to you for whatever reason, for your probably more local community. You see deities for specific professions. So again, it's that more deities serve, if you like, to sacralize certain, the most important factors of our lives, the place we live, the jobs we do. You'll also see for certain key aspects of human life. So fertility is one, being able to have children, you'll often go to a certain one. I mean, some of these reassert themselves just because they serve important human functions in monotheism. So in Christianity, for example, you want to go on a perilous journey, you pray to Saint Christopher, you want to have a baby, you pray, you pray to different saints. And if you like, this is a kind of certain resurgence of a more pagan way of thinking.
one thing that I find so funny is I don't know if it's probably a bit disrespectful when I when I belittle this practice, but and I guess we only have Islamic sources about this, or maybe some different sources. But this whole divination, arrows of shooting arrows into the sky, and then depending on which arrow goes further or which arrow is closer, you then come to a conclusion that your God told you to go with this choice instead of that choice. Is that an accurate description of what people actually would do, or is this again just based on legends? Or
Yes, divination is a bit of a kind of catch-all for a whole host of practices which is an understandable thing that humans still want today, is to reduce unpredictability in your life and make decisions. So ideally, you want more information, so you can do it by practices, or especially for pre-modern setup where it's much more difficult to make scientific determination. So, but how it was done, so you get kind of mocking though. Some of the Islamic sources are kind of mocking these pagan practices, whereas presumably, they made a lot of sense at the time. It's difficult because for us, being able to massively determine a lot of things in our lives, and with an impressive science that can reduce and mitigate disasters, then it's difficult for us to get into the minds of people who had so little influence and was so much a plaything, of various factors, weather, disease, and so on. And so it becomes really important to have these different tools, divination, magic, and so on, which are these. I mean, you could liken, as often is, magic to science, where you're using it to try and have some influence, determine, influence nature.
Yeah, I guess it would be kind of easy to simply rely on, in the example of arrows, to simply shoot two arrows and then just go with whatever seems to be the correct answer, instead of praying and thinking about it and then going with your gut feelings. I guess it's easier to do the more primitive one. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you'll find these. So there's an old one in medieval Europe. So you have a dice, and you simply have on the faces of it the thing that you'll do in that situation. And so you roll the dice.
Problem solved.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, Japan is quite big on different forms of divination. So there's still a number of advanced cultures that use divination in different ways.
One more issue, which is Mecca. Now, the Islamic narrative is very big on Mecca, and basically, even if the Quran calls Mecca the mother of cities, uh, and in Muslim culture, it is generally understood and taught that Mecca was of huge significance before Islam as well. That it has a vast history, that people came there from all around. But when we look at the history, we don't really find anything about Mecca prior to Islam. Right? We only find some hints at certain things that may be identified with Mecca. Uh, what can you say about that? For me, it is very easy to say, "Hey, it looks like Mecca was not significant at all. This is all just made up." But what would you say from a more academic perspective about this?
Yeah, so there's a few fixed points, I suppose. Well, one, there is zero concrete information about Mecca before Islam. So, end of story. Even when people use the Quran, which you just did, they the Quran doesn't actually say Mecca is the mother of cities. So it refers to the mother of cities, but it doesn't identify it. The second thing, although there hasn't been archaeological excavation, there were travelers before Saudi Arabia existed who described the place. And what we can say from that is, of course, negative. Travelers past Palmyra and Petra, saw massive columns and huge structures. So there was nothing like that in Mecca. So it's only kind of been a sort of big trading metropolis, as some, including modern Western scholars, have said, because there would have been, what humans do when you've got a lot of money, you want to show off. And so there's no grand structures. What was there before? I mean, it's not impossible the Kaaba itself was moved, so we can't be 100% sure, even that was there before. I tend to assume that you wouldn't get such a radical change in place, though. The fact that Mecca, we get Arabic inscriptions from the area quite early on, and the fact that the pilgrimage happened to it, I don't like the idea, although some put out that there was a total change, because I tend to feel it's like some people argue that Muhammad was actually a Christian, or he was something, or he didn't exist. The problem I always find with this sort of radical change is, how did that not get noticed? If people are worshipping something totally different, and then some, oh, now we're going to start worshipping this Arabian guy, people are likely to say something. So I could imagine that Mecca was one of many sanctuaries, early sanctuaries, but I can't, and that its importance gradually increased. But to be honest, I don't think it that likely that it didn't exist at all. But it just can't have been that really major sort of metropolis, because it just,
as far as I see it, to clarify, I just think the whole Mecca is not made up. The whole story of it is not made up. I just think, to me, it just looks like, as you very much hinted, Mecca was a place of certain religious practices for a small tribe, and it wasn't of historical global significance. But after the rise of Islam, which happened due to many different factors, the importance of Mecca was hugely blown out of proportion. It was turned into something hugely significant that it actually wasn't prior to Islam. That's what it looks like to me, but that's just me. And but one thing is also the Romans. The Romans were interested in conquering places of great value, and what you also describe in your books is that they don't go much further south than, I don't know, just south of Madain Saleh and these regions, and Mecca would then be very near for them, to simply go and conquer if it was a place of such huge significance. But they never even refer to it. They never give any importance to it. It's never touched. That just looks to me like the Islamic narrative is a little bit problematic.
Yeah, I mean, the one little factoid that people pick up is this reference in a Latin geographical source to Macoraba.
Yeah.
And a lot is made of this, using this interpretation of it as an Aramaic expression for Makkah, Rabba, so big Mecca, great Mecca. But it really strains, to my mind, interpretation. And it's very vague where I think it's Pliny actually says it is. So, yeah, to my mind, it's not very convincing to argue that that is Mecca.
And even in that text, the description of it is basically that there is a place along the coast that people go to, and and there is not much. There's not a huge significance given to that either. It just happens to appear, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Finally, this is not entirely the topic of our conversation. I would love to have another conversation with you on this very specific topic, the spread of Islam. There is often people often wonder how exactly it happened that such an underdeveloped culture, or such an underdeveloped variety of cultures, like Arabia, uh, exploded and expanded so rapidly from that primitive point into the Roman and Persian empires, and conquered so much land in such little time. And some apologists, even go as far as to claim that this is this is somehow miraculous, and it somehow proves the truth of Islam. To me, it seems like this is not necessarily miraculous. It may just be a series of, events of luck, and certain other cultures, nomadic tribes in Asia, did the same things over and over again at different times in history. What is your? I very much read your opinion on this whole issue in the book, but what is your opinion on how and why the Arabs managed to suddenly expand and shock the world like that?
Yeah, there's a few different questions in that, really. People focus on the actual scale of the conquest, but to me, that's actually the least surprising, because pastoralist groups are very good at it. They have a lot of access to manpower and military training. So Mongols, Turks, you're right, throughout history, they managed to achieve conquests very fast and very on a big scale. But what they don't normally manage to do is to hold on to it for very long. And that's actually, to my mind, the fascinating thing about the Arab conquest. I deliberately called my book, gave the subtitle in my book, In God's Path to Arab Conquest and Islamic Civilization, because the conquests do lead onto a broad civilization that endures. And that's the striking bit of it. And that's the bit that needs kind of more taking apart. It's got much more to do with the way in which Islam spread among settled peoples. It's not to do with the initial expansion. The success of the initial expansion, and again, it has the same factors as the Mongol conquest, where you have a lot of pastoralist groups in not just Arabia going up into the Syrian desert, so that broad area near the Roman and Persian centers. And the great thing for, as I said, pastoralist groups, one, they're used to military training from a young age, and two, it's possible to somebody can be left behind to look after the animals, and a lot of the high proportion of people can go off to fight, whereas agriculturists don't have that luxury. Pre-modern agriculture requires a high amount of people, so only a small amount relatively can be spared. So pastoralist groups have manpower, so that kind of explains their successes. The initial impetus is still interesting. Why exactly then? I just take it that because the empires are weakened by the Roman and Persian empires, substantially weakened after 25 years of war, that this is a great opportunity. What tends to happen with pastoralist groups is they're always raiding because they find it difficult to get enough food and sustenance off just breeding their own animals. So they tend to launch raids, and we know that from Roman sources. That all the time they're reporting small-scale raids, but they're kept in check. So presumably they weren't kept in check in the 630s, and therefore it kind of snowballed.
Could it be that the difference here is, and I have to credit Islam here, I guess, but could it be that the difference is very much that, for example, when the Mongols invaded half the world, they were quite ruthless in their in their expansions, and when they conquered lands, they were very much simply focused on becoming conquerors, becoming the leaders, the gods of the world, and created this syncretism of their own religion and the local religions, or ended up converting to Islam, for example. When other tribes conquered lands, they were very much focused on simply becoming richer and benefiting from the riches of the places that they conquered. Whereas in Islam, um, Islam did not simply the Muslims did not simply conquer and pillage. What they did is they conquered and pillaged, but they also established a system which made sure that everything will stay in place. This will become the new law. Everyone will abide by this. There will be no more infighting and so on. So could it be that it is merely Islam which gave a little bit structure and which prevented these conquered lands from slipping away again?
So again, you're talking about the later point. Why does it lead to an enduring civilization? Not the you're mixing up two things there because the conquest. It's easy to say, well, the Muslims were nicer than the Mongols. That's probably not true, to be honest. In fact, it's interesting, really. People, I think, probably because academics are relatively left wing, so there's a lot of there's one professor, Fred Donner at Chicago, who came up with this idea of the non-violent conquest of the Muslims. It's a kind of apologetic idea. Conquests are violent. And the Muslim sources are quite happy. They don't actually have any problem with saying that we beheaded lots of people and set fire to them. So the Muslims aren't being at all PC about it. So it's plenty of good violence, beheadings, everything is all there, slaughter, the works. So that bit's quite similar. But you're right in that, of course, why does it continue on and lead to a new civilization? The Mongols have nothing to offer in terms of religion. Nobody wants to convert to the sky god. Very few people of the Christians and Jews. Whereas converting to Islam, one interesting thing about Islam is it has, having no clergy means you don't need to do anything to convert. You don't need to have lessons with a priest or something like that, which is a potential bar. It's easy for anyone to convert. And it obviously fits very closely within Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religion. So that obviously helps. But then there's a whole host of other factors, I think, as well that matter. But that's certainly one of them, that Islam makes it integrates and makes it easy for people to share in this new.
I guess one thing that made it strong to me, in my opinion, is that contrary to some other religious ideas, Islam had this simple thing like, okay, we conquered you. You can simply escape death by converting as well. Or you can make an agreement with us and pay so much protection money and then live in our land as lesser people as long as you pay the money. But as far as I understand, that didn't necessarily go very smoothly in many cases, especially in the early conquests, where people were massacred without even the chance of becoming dhimmis and paying the jizya.
Yeah, one of the problems we have, and this is true of any war situation, is that it gets written up later and it gets simplified and systematized, and it's clinicized really because it's away from the bloodshed. So this very simple idea that the Muslims walked along and said, hey, you can either pay your tax or you can convert or you can be killed. Nice, simple. And again, it's it's the way that conquerors, their conquering narrative works. It's kind of seen as, when it gets written up, it's a nice, simple kind of thing. It's like films of battles of World War II or something. It's very easy. We clever allies managed to defeat those nasty, stupid Germans. It all gets tidied up. Whereas if you actually kind of go into the details, it's a lot more messy. Very complex.
No, that's very fair. That is very fair. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hoyland. I really appreciated this conversation. I think there was a lot to take from here, a lot to learn. I would also love to meet up again sometime, talk about varieties of different matters. I really appreciate your work. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Is there anything else that you want to share?
No, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about a subject I really love. So that was great. Thank you.
That's awesome. That's a pleasure to me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Everybody, thank you for watching. I will see you again very soon. Let me know what you think about this conversation and about future conversations in the comment section. I will see you again. Everybody have a fantastic day. Yeah. I usually say a final line, but I don't want to say that when I have academics on here. So